Good morning, everybody. Welcome to MC Webinars on this slightly grey day, but thank you for joining us. As you know, today we're talking about the future of work from an economic development perspective. We've got Will Cookson, who is our Director of Economic Development, and Duncan Brown, who is the Senior Economist with MC. So we're going to have questions at the end, so please put them in the control panel and we'll get to them at the end of the presentation. So over to you, Will. Good morning.
Thanks, Debbie. Good morning, all. So yes, as Debbie's mentioned, we're going to be looking at the future of work and trying to hone in on an economic development perspective. Yeah, do ask questions, always really helpful, and we'll get to those at the end. Just going to take you through the agenda. Introductions we have done. We're then going to have a look at the big picture view of the labour market, which Duncan will take us through. We're then going to explore disruptors in terms of automation and migration, and looking at those combined as well. Take questions, and then we'll provide a summary towards the end. And then there's a few other announcements that I'm going to cover at the end as well, which in regards to future webinars and a forum that we have planned for October. So Duncan, the big picture, and it does look rather grey and stormy on this picture.
It's big though.
It's big.
That's an important thing for metaphorical reasons, obviously. So yeah, we're just going to kind of cover off a few kind of key facts about the labour market at this point. And as it says there, it's in some choppy water. And I'll probably talk about that before we go into it, because it's probably worth sort of bearing in mind that what I'm going to go on to say is that actually, as things stand, the labour market is really tight. You know, the story of the last or most of the last decade, you know, since 2010 has been, you know, pretty prodigious growth in employment demand, leading to record highs in terms of jobs, and actually, as I'll go on to in a moment, unemployment now down actually at a level that I think you have to go back before I was born, and I'm not that young, to have seen before. The choppy waters, though, is that that there's a lot going on around it that suggests that might have some bumps ahead. You know, so the one that everybody fixates on is Brexit, which is, you know, for perfectly obvious reasons. There's a lot of uncertainty out there. Quite what happens, who knows? I don't think literally anybody knows what happens in the coming months on that front. But, you know, in the short term, the labour market effect could go lots of different ways. It could, for example, you know, lead to increases in employment in some areas and decreases in others. So that's a bit of an uncertainty. But the bigger point on the choppy waters is that the global economy is not looking so healthy at the moment. In Europe, several countries are, you know, really stuttering for growth, and so leaving aside any changes to our trading relationship with them, there's, you know, some real clouds on the horizon there. And then, you know, looking globally, the Chinese economy sort of is probably overdue a correction for some years now as well. And so there are headwinds in that sense. But on the other hand, it doesn't feel from the data so far like a kind of a blowout like we had in the late 2000s. And one of the things that really marks out the recovery since that recession following the financial crisis is how vigorous the recovery in the labour market's been. So if it's tight now, it's probably going to stay tight with some ups and downs into the future. So if we go on to the next one, we can look at just how tight it's become. So this is what's called a beverage curve, and this is the kind of chart that economists like, that then they have to spend half an hour explaining, but I won't do it in half an hour. On the x-axis we have the unemployment rate, which is the one we all know and love and quibble about as to whether it counts the right people and so on, but this is the ILO version of the unemployment rate. It's the one that's internationally comparable and includes all those that are seeking work regardless of whether they're on benefits or not. And then on the y-axis, we have the vacancy rate, which is the share of vacancies reported by employers as a percentage of the share of people in the labour market. So it's kind of people in employment and unemployed people. And so, and it traces it over time. I think it's quarterly data going back to the early 2000s. And so this kind of bluish greyish colour around the 5% mark was life before the financial crisis, where actually the labour market was both, fairly low unemployment, 5%, a level that for the preceding kind of 20 years had been a sort of a real kind of feeling of, that's a good unemployment rate. And the vacancy rate was fairly robust, with about, one and a bit new jobs for every 50 people in the labour market. Then we have the financial crisis, and this is the green line, where it zooms down and to the right. So all of a sudden, the vacancy rate plummets, and that drags unemployment up because people can't leave unemployment to find work. And then the yellow line is from 2010, and you see that there's a sort of a mess around the 8% mark there, where it dawdled for a bit around 2010, 2011, and then all of a sudden started to storm back from about 2013. And you see the vacancy rate pulling the unemployment rate back down. And then it got to pretty much the area that we were used to before the financial crisis, around the time we had the Brexit referendum. And you may remember the Treasury had this rather rash forecast that if there was a leave vote, then unemployment would rise just because of the vote. And that actually the data went the other way. And nobody's quite sure why. I think that, even if you weren't sure about the Treasury's forecast, you wouldn't have thought unemployment would have gone down since then, because after all, it's now gone down. As the data show there, the vacancy rate has gone higher. It's since come down a bit, and the unemployment rate has gone down to around 4%, a level that wasn't seen all the way through the boom leading up to the financial crisis. And so the labour market is remarkably tight at the moment. And so if we go on to the next slide, we can see what this looks like. So the chart at the top there is plotting the kind of the relationship to unemployment to vacancies from the early 2000s to earlier this year. And so you'll see that when we get the financial crisis, the unemployment to vacancy ratio shoots up, and all of a sudden it's kind of we have about 2.5 times the number of unemployed people for every job vacancy in the economy. It took a while for that to start moving down, but then it's moved down, and it's actually moved down lower than where it was before. Now, one of the interesting things, of course, and I say interesting in a negative way, is that earnings really haven't felt the kind of the effect of that labour market tightness through much of that period. So you'll see that real growth in earnings, taking account of inflation in the early 2000s, was kind of typically 2% and above. And then through the recession in its aftermath, it was often negative and is picked up for a bit, then got hit by the devaluation in sterling after the referendum, and has since started to move back up again. I mean, the labour market is now, as I say, really tight. And the latest data as of yesterday is that I think pay is growing by about 4% nominal, which is about 2% after inflation. So we are back to that level. But one of the other dimensions, pay is just one dimension of how a tight labour market manifests itself. And these two at the bottom are other ways, because as well as not getting the pay rise that you want, you might also be stuck in a part-time job when you want a full-time job. And so the green line there shows that actually that carried on going up, that phenomenon of people in part-time jobs but wanting full-time, until about 2013. And since then it's steadily reduced. And so now it's back down towards the levels that we saw before the financial crisis. And the same with people who are in temporary jobs but want permanent as well. So even if pay hasn't always picked up quite as we would hope, there's still those signs of a tight labour market. So a tight labour market does mean rising sort of results for workers in it. And so in many ways it's a good thing, but of course it carries problems in its way because employers struggle to find skills and so on. So sure. That's where we are, and with some caveats about sort of potential for turbulence in the near term. But let's go on to the next slide, because what we want to talk about in a bit more detail is, and you know, there's lots of discussion about this, about the disruptions that will change the long-term trend. You know, there may well be some headwinds from Brexit and from the global economy, but ultimately we hope anyway that the economy will return to a normal path, that the labour market will tighten again. But of course there are trends around it that can change that. And if we've got a picture of the Terminator to start, it won't be the first robot we see. This one might be somewhat less impressive, but we'll get to that in good time. In fact, there's two other robots that we'll see really. So if we go to the first of these substantive slides, so the first thing I want to say is that automation has been with us for quite some time, because if we talk about automation as the replacement of workers with machines, the substitution of labour with capital, then actually that's the story of manufacturing over the sort of the decades. And so what we've got here is, the good thing about manufacturing is that the data go back a long way. And so what we've got here is a chart of employment in manufacturing and output, as in the gross value add from manufacturing, going back to the 50s. And what we see is, you know, output going up and employment going down. So manufacturing employment in the UK peaked in the early 60s with about 8 million jobs, and then by the time of the financial crisis it was, you know, down at around 2.6 million jobs. And so actually we've lost about 2/3 of manufacturing employment in that time. But on the other hand, you look at manufacturing output and it's basically doubled through much of that period. It has been relatively stable over the last decade or two. But for the period where there was the greatest job losses, actually manufacturing continued to increase its output. And there's two things to say about this really. One is that you know, what we've seen here is exactly the kind of transaction that drives automation, that employers, manufacturing employers, were able to achieve increased output while shedding workers effectively. Bad news for the workers, good news for the employers, you know, at the end of the day. But the economic side of this is a huge productivity gain. Effectively, we've shed 2/3 of the workforce and doubled output. Well, you know, that's a big move in productivity terms. We've got about 6 times the productivity as a result of that. You know, for every hour worked in manufacturing, it's 5 or 6 times more output that you get. And I am just doing those numbers in my head, so if they're not exactly right, then don't shoot me later. But you get the message that basically manufacturing job losses have been the price that we've paid for improved productivity, which of course is really important for driving economic growth. So that's, you know, and that's the thing, that when we talk about automation and the fear of job loss, it's a very real thing and a very important thing. But at the same time, we can look at it from another frame of reference, which is that if we don't embrace technology, then we don't achieve the productivity growth that we want. And productivity is what drives living standards as well. So all these things matter together, and that creates a real tension in how we develop economies nationally as well as locally, in terms of how best we can take advantage of new technology to drive up our productivity, but then adapt our labour market to create the right jobs in the right places to deal with the consequences of that. We've gone to the next slide. So one of the things that it's worth considering is that for all the talk about automation, actually there are quite big differences in how much new technology is adopted. So this looks at manufacturing. It's from a body called the International Federation for Robotics, which collects data from around the world from factories on how many robots they have. And they have this data set which allows them to measure the number of robots per 10,000 manufacturing employees in different countries. And so you might not be surprised to see South Korea there way out in front with 631 robots for every 10,000 manufacturing employees. Highly high-tech manufacturing in South Korea, which is why, of course, a lot of TVs are made there and all kinds of things these days. Again, you might not be surprised to see that amongst the rest, Germany and Japan score highly, 309 and 303 respectively. Then you've got the US and Italy in the 180s, and then France in 138. And the question mark there is the UK. And if we press onto the next slide, we can see that we're way down at 71. So for all of our discussion about the rise of the robots and the rampaging of automation through our industry, actually we've got some way to go to just be at the average. We are way down the rankings. I mean, I've only done the sort of the larger and more notable economies here. You could go to, I think, Slovakia, for example, which in overall terms is a less developed economy than the UK, having emerged from communism only in the early 90s. But it's much further ahead in terms of the adoption of robotics into manufacturing. And so when we have this ongoing discussion, as we do, about our poor productivity performance, and at the same time we have this other discussion about the threat of automation to jobs, well, to some extent we're going to need to address it to seek automation if we're going to close some of that automation gap, some of that productivity gap. So this is not something that we can afford to just say we don't want automation, even though it has big labour market consequences. And so really, as we go on to the next slide,
we're going to get some more robots.
Yes, but actually our robot economy is a bit more Metal Mickey, and apologies for webinar attendees that are younger than probably about 35. Metal Mickey was a kids TV program in the sort of around 1980. But yes, our robot economy is a lot more Metal Mickey than Terminator at the moment, and so not very threatening really. And so if we go on to the next slide, here's an example of why, of some of the trends that actually tell against automation in our economy. So this is a robot. This is an automated car wash, because all a robot does is replace a worker in terms of doing some kind of task in a way that is, either as effective or more effective without the labour involved. And you think about the effective productivity that an automated car wash has. You could have several people washing that car. Maybe it takes them, maybe it's a team of 6 taking 10 minutes each, so that's 1 person hour. And say it raises exactly the same revenue as that car wash. Well, the car wash is probably a few seconds of a checkout operator's time to process the transaction. So we measure productivity in terms of the amount of output compared to the amount of labour involved. So an automated car wash is, say, £10 for a few seconds of labour, whereas a manual car wash might be £10 for 1 hour of labour. And so the productivity difference of an automated car wash is enormous. But here's the thing: automated car washes have declined in the UK over the past 20 years. There have been, I can't remember the exact number, but around half of them have been taken out of action in that time. And the reason for that is because we've had a large number of migrant workers moving to the car valeting industry, which allows them to outcompete robotics, because buying an automatic car wash requires a big upfront capital investment. So if you can't compete with what's often an ex-petrol station, which you can turn into a car valeting station, well, actually, then you're going to de-automate, basically. And so that's been the story of the car valeting industry over the past 10, 20 years in the UK. And so the productivity effect of that is actually dreadful. It might mean that we might get better or worse car washes. I gather the machines aren't that great for cars in the long run. And certainly it's created a lot more jobs. But in productivity terms, it's actually negative. It's actually lowered overall productivity in a very small section of the economy. But the point applies more generally. And if we go on to the next slide, we can see that actually the UK has had the biggest move of migrant workers of these 3 major European economies. You can see that back in 1995, foreign nationals' percentage of the workforce were a relatively small percentage, and now it's over 10%. And so whereas France is broadly stable and Germany has increased somewhat, but from a higher base. And so if you go on to the next slide, the interesting thing in this conversation is that a lot of those have gone into jobs that actually are fairly automatable. So we have an automation index for occupations, and so we've plotted every occupation. Each one of these dots is one of the SOC 4 occupations in the ONS's taxonomy. And so along the x-axis, we've plotted them according to how automatable they are. So if you're 100% on the x-axis, then you're at the top percentile for your ability to be automated. Basically, your job, a lot of it could be done by machines, whereas if you're at the 0% point, then basically you couldn't be automated at all. And then on the y-axis, what we've done is we've looked at the ranking of jobs in terms of employers' tendency to use recent migrants. I think it's those within the last 5 years that they've entered the UK labour market. And so that creates 4 quadrants for us. So jobs on the bottom left, which includes teaching professionals, nurses, teaching assistants, are those that haven't been heavily reliant upon migrant labour. You'll see nurses there is just in this category because it's been somewhat reliant on it. But teaching assistants is way down there. But they're also not very automatable, and you'll notice that it's things like teachers and nurses, because actually those jobs are quite difficult to get a machine to do. You need a person, you need their judgment and all the rest of it. Then on the bottom right hand side, we have those jobs which are highly automatable but haven't also attracted a lot of migrant labour, so admin roles, bookkeepers, retail managers. So it's the 2 boxes at the top which are probably the more interesting ones. So we've got the ones at the top left which are have attracted a lot of migrant labour but are also really difficult to automate. So things like care workers, very difficult to get a machine substitute for somebody in looking after a vulnerable person. You've got chefs there as well. Actually somebody who's leading the preparation of food, deciding what food is being prepared and all that. Sales accounts and business development managers, you need somebody to go and make those relationships. So those are the jobs where actually you can understand that they're difficult to automate, and if they've been difficult to recruit for, you can understand why employers have sought out migrant workers. But then you get to this category at the top right, which is the more interesting one for this discussion about automation, where these are the jobs that are often looking like they could be automated more in the future, but we've also attracted a lot of migrant labour. And so you can see right at the top there, I might have to move the control panel for the webinar. Hang on. So cleaners and domestics is up there. I think carvalities is right in the top corner. I only labelled up the most the largest roles here, but elementary warehouse workers, waiters and waitresses, kitchen and catering staff. And so these are the jobs that we've actually grown quite significantly in a lot of cases through the use of migrant labour, but at the same time they're also highly automatable. And so if you think about this in an economic development perspective, on the one hand we want to increase productivity, which is actually primarily driven by automation a lot of the time. But on the other hand, we're growing labour markets in these areas by attracting labour from elsewhere. And it does make you think that, is this a sustainable path if technology takes the path that we think it will, or are we creating jobs that actually we're going to be dispensing with over the next 10 to 20 years? And so if we go on to the next chart, what we've done is that we've taken how those occupations have been categorized into those 4 groups, and you can see that actually it's so you've got the high automation, high migration category there, which we've added about 934,000 jobs between 2010 and 2018. So it's actually quite a significant net gain in jobs that we think that actually we're probably going to be leaning against with technology in the long run. And so on the right hand side, we plotted the concentration of those jobs, and you see sort of around the wash there, you get a few local authorities which have got quite bright colours, and that reflects some around the Midlands as well, where they've got a lot of these jobs, things like in the food packing industries and in warehousing and things like that, where they're really heavily concentrated. And so it does raise questions about the sustainability of job creation in those areas, that effectively we're creating a lot of jobs and feeding them through the attraction of labour from overseas, but actually the technology in the long run will tell against that, and all of a sudden your industry base in terms of employment might start becoming superseded by machinery over the next 10 to 20 years. And so that raises big questions for economic developers about getting the right kinds of jobs. And also, when we talk about inclusive growth, for example, about where it leaves you if you've attracted a significant new labour force, and then all of a sudden the jobs start disappearing for it as well. And so if we go on to the final slide, which is, I think, the summing up one.
We're just gonna have a quick check on questions. The only question I've got is regarding recordings. Everyone that's registered for the webinar will receive a recording. So I think we can move on to the summing up, Duncan.
Yep. No questions, so carry on, guys.
So yeah, I mean, so as we said at the start, the labour market is looking extremely tight and showing real signs of it in terms of pay growth returning to a sort of a positive level. The reduction in the number of people in part-time jobs that want full-time or temp jobs that want permanent jobs. The caveat on that, as I said, is that there are some sort of headwinds in terms of the macroeconomic environment, which may tell against it for a while. As we look to the long term, automation is one way of loosening the labour market and driving productivity. And actually, the UK is not really a leading adopter of new technology. And so if we think about our productivity gap, that's one area where we really need to step up the pace. But actually, as the sort of the car wash example shows, that migration supported growth in a lot of labour intensive roles, which would otherwise be at risk of being automated over recent years. And so actually, and one thing I didn't mention earlier, which is that one of the dimensions in which productivity growth has been slow is that we've had a lot of growth in labour intensive industries, often sort of feeding their job growth through migration. And so the final point there is that automation does represent some real risks. It represents risks to workers that are affected, and we've already seen that in past years. And as I said earlier about the decline of manufacturing industry, but also opportunities for productivity growth. But it really is quite a turn, because over the last 20 years, and certainly since the recession, we really have pursued quite a labour-intensive economic model. One where we've really focused on often, sometimes quite low-value industries, not always, but sometimes, and focused very much on getting the labour market to create lots of jobs to drive growth. And that's had some successes, and we certainly have a very vigorous labour market. But of course, if we want productivity, then if productivity is measured as we mainly measure it, which is output relative to our labour, then in the end we're probably going to be replacing some of that labour with capital. And how we manage that, having really pursued this labour intensive model, is going to be a big challenge in the years ahead.
Thank you, Duncan. Really insightful. Thanks for sharing your thoughts on this. I do want to mention we're not going to leave automation there. We are in the process of completing a report which will be published late September, early October, and we're going to run a webinar towards the end of October where we're looking at automation in terms of really digging into understanding the risk. This webinar will be useful for anyone looking at it from an economic development point of view. So yeah, just to say there's more to come. You'll be able to register for that webinar through our website, and it's due to take place on the 30th of October at 11 AM. I also wanted to mention we've got our first annual Economic Development Forum, the Science of the Possible. Now, this is going to be taking place in Birmingham. It's primarily targeted at MZ customers. Duncan will be joining us as well, so we'll have some more insight from Duncan. And really what we're going to be looking at is we're going to be looking at MZ data and really using it as a way of ensuring that our customers have a good understanding of how we model data, what sits behind it. Lots of opportunities for networking as well, and for us to run past you some of the new developments that we have coming down the line. So do attend. You can register for that on our website. I'll also send out to everyone attended a personal invite as well. It's a free event, central location in terms of the country, and we'll provide some more information on that through the registration link. So I think that just leaves me to thank you all for attending. Do join us at one of those future events, and do come back to us if you have any immediate thoughts or questions. My contact details are here. And like I said, I'll be making contact with a recording of this if you want to share it with colleagues or your network. So thanks a lot.